one of the reasons we've done this, because as business people, we aren't the best communicators about the reasons we make our living this way. So we bring in these expert advocates for free markets and limited government, and ask them to speak for us. And about 15 years ago, Larry and I became friends at the Foundation for Economic Education, and their magazine, The Free Man, which lies on our entryway coffee table, 5 times a year carries a column by Larry Reed. So you probably have read him, even if you haven't met him until today. So it's with a great deal of pleasure that I bring Larry Reed, who is the president of his Michigan think tank, the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, and I'm going to ask him to speak for me.
Okay. Thanks, Ethel May. Thanks, everybody. She didn't tell you this, but I've referred to Ethel May for a number of years now as my Missouri mom. And I don't have moms in all 50 states. And she's very, very special. So I really appreciate this opportunity and look forward to spending this hour with you. I have a little icebreaker to open with I thought you'd get a kick out of. I'm an economist, but not the kind that regals you with number after number. This is more of a rhetorical presentation than it is a numerical one. And so you might appreciate this little bit of arithmetic. If all of the milk produced in this nation in 1 year was in quart containers and lined up side by side as it is on the grocer's shelves, this line would reach around the earth at the equator 140 times. Or if these same quart containers were stacked one on top of the other, this stack would reach to the moon 30 times. Or if we had a river that reached from Boston to San Francisco, 3,000 miles long, 40 feet wide, and 3 feet deep, it would hold only 1 year's production of milk in this country. If all the people employed in the dairy industry were made into one giant man, it would take 1 full year's cotton crop to make him a pair of overalls. I never have found out, by the way, who did these numbers. I've always assumed it was probably on a federal grant. If all of the cows in the country that produced 1 day's supply of milk were in one giant cow, her left front foot would be in Lake Michigan, her right front foot would be in Lake Erie, her left hind foot would be in the Gulf of Mexico, and her right hind foot would be in the Caribbean Sea. She could switch flies off the equator with her tail, tear up the St. Lawrence Seaway with her horns, and lick the mist off the northern lights with her tongue. And finally, according to these calculations, if she eats the normal amount of green grass and her body functions are normal, standing in this position in Cuba, located where it is, we should be able to take care of Castro once and for all. Well, my subject this morning is the Standard Oil story. I think maybe the full title we gave it was Witch Hunting for Robber Barons, the Standard Oil Story. I usually give it under that title. And it's a great story of American entrepreneurship with a lot of myths that are debunked in the course of this next 45 minutes. And I want to begin by reminding you that there is a common conception out there, which I regard as a myth, that the latter part of the 19th century in America was a time of increasing monopoly and decreasing competition. The myth, as most students learn in high schools these days, would have us believe that this was the era of the robber barons and the American economy was becoming increasingly concentrated and monopolistic, less and less competitive. That's the generally accepted view of things. But I want to present to you a different thesis and then use the story of the great boogeyman Standard Oil to help demonstrate it. And the thesis I want to present has a name to it. It's called the Kolko thesis, K-O-L-K-O, named for Gabriel Kolko, who, I should add, is a socialist. He doesn't agree with me, maybe many of you, on general public policy ideas today. He believes in bigger government. And yet, he is a superb historian, and he wrote a book that those of us who believe in free markets have widely embraced, quite enthusiastic about. He wrote it some 25, 30 years ago. And he has a very different thesis about the American economy in the latter part of the 19th century. I like to cite him because then a critic is a little bit less quick to say, well, this is just more free market propaganda. I can say, wait a minute, this is a socialist saying this. He took a look at industry after industry and arrived at a thesis, now called the Kolko thesis, which is that in the latter half of the 19th century, the American economy was becoming more competitive and less concentrated, less monopolistic in industry after industry. Just the opposite of what most of us have been taught. And in fact, he looked at particular industries that have been charged with things like predatory price cutting and collusion and conspiracy to restrict output and raise prices. And he found that, yeah, there were attempts to do those sorts of things on occasion, but he said he couldn't find a single one that actually worked for very long at all. And that most of the time, these secret agreements that were attempted to restrict output and raise prices actually didn't last any longer than it took for the ink to dry on them, for reasons I'll go into in some detail in just a moment. Well, that's quite a different perspective than what we typically have learned. And to drive this home, I want to use the story of the Standard Oil Company to make these points. Standard Oil is the great boogeyman. Any conventional high school, even college history text will present Standard Oil as the number one boogeyman, the worst of the robber barons, the company that just ran roughshod over other people, built this massive empire, controlled markets, pushed people around, drove competitors out, abused consumers, and what have you. And if you go back and look at these texts, you may, with a critical eye, be amazed at how much is simply presented as if it's fact with no documentation. Just mere assertions, as if everybody just knows that this was all the case. A very little attempt most of the time to elaborate and provide much detail. Does anybody know what Americans used for lighting in their homes in the decades before kerosene, which is what the Standard Oil Company at first was producing? What were we using before we switched to a crude oil product, kerosene? Any guesses? Animal fat, whale oil in particular, absolutely. Whale oil was the prevailing fuel for lighting for decades, well into the 19th century, in fact into the 1860s, until companies like Standard discovered ways to take crude oil from below the earth and refine it into a usable product. But something interesting began to happen by the early part of the 19th century. We had increasing demand through industrialization for more lighting, more fuel, more whale oil. But whales were owned kind of communally. You know, they're common property, owned by nobody. In effect, sometimes people would say, well, then they're owned by everybody, but that reduces to being owned by nobody. And as a result, there was incentive to use the supply and draw it down, but very little incentive for anybody, and maybe we didn't have the technology anyway, to grow the supply or to conserve it. So every incentive to use and abuse, but not to conserve and to grow. So what do you suppose happened in this era of no federal government price controls on whale oil as the demand rose and the supply didn't keep up? Prices soared. Through the early decades of the 19th century, prices were going up. How we managed this without a Department of Energy is beyond me. But we didn't have a bureaucracy charged with managing a problem into perpetuity. And instead, we allowed the market to do its thing. And the rising prices for whale oil caused a couple things to happen. One, it crimped demand. Some people found ways to do with less, some very creatively. People found that, you know, maybe maybe I can concentrate my reading during the daytime instead of after dark. Or they found any number of ways to make do with less. But more importantly, what happened on the supply side is what changed the world. The higher prices for whale oil acted as a powerful incentive for entrepreneurs to find an alternative. And there was this stuff surfacing on the creeks of northwestern Pennsylvania, known to the Indians. They were using it for war paint and things like that. And it was known to be flammable. And the question in the minds of these early oil entrepreneurs was, is this stuff commercially viable? Can we find it in large enough quantity, bring it forth at a reasonable cost, and do enough to it to make it a clean burning fuel? And so in the 1850s, there was a search to find how to make this stuff more usable, and where it came from and in what quantity. And it was in 1859 in my home state of Pennsylvania, at a little place called Titusville, where Colonel Edwin Drake was the first to strike oil in the form of a gusher. It really was. When he hit it, it just blew through the contraption he had built to sink the well and blew oil all over the place. But that's an interesting story because Drake was sent by a consortium of Connecticut businessmen to northwestern Pennsylvania to try to find this stuff in large enough quantity and see what he could do with it. He ran out of the money they gave him. They said, come on back, forget it, it's probably not going to work. And he went out on a limb and borrowed another $500, and that was about gone when he struck this gusher. And that was the start of a tremendous oil boom. If you've ever seen photographs, and there are a lot of them around, of what the hills of western Pennsylvania looked like in the 1860s and 70s, if you looked at them from a distance, you think, wow, lots of trees on that mountain. You look closer and you see they're not trees, they're derricks. Oil derricks being built and wells being sunk all over the mountains of western Pennsylvania. In later years, John D. Rockefeller will testify in Congress about this period, and he will point out that, in his words, it seemed like everybody and his brother was sinking a well in northwestern Pennsylvania. A lot of chaos in the sense that you had people who really didn't know much about what to do with the stuff once they brought it forth, and a lot of accidents and what have you, and boom towns followed by ghost towns and what have you. And there was quite a shakeout in later years as the better entrepreneurs assumed mastery over the business. Well, in this chaotic atmosphere, in the early oil boom, emerges a young man named John D. Rockefeller. And I know that we associate that name today with great wealth, but John D. was not born into great wealth. He didn't have a silver spoon in his mouth. He was a bookkeeper, he was a grocer, and by the way, he was a man from his early teens who regularly, faithfully tithed to his church. In fact, kept meticulous records. You can still see at one of his estates outside of Irvington, New York, in fact. You can see his records that he kept meticulously over the years of how he spent all of his money and how much he tithed to his church. He saved his money, he borrowed some more, and in 1865 he co-founded a partnership in the oil refining business. And in 1870, just 5 years later, he formed the Standard Oil Company, 1870. And it was focused not so much on the discovery and the drilling, but on the refining of crude oil. In 1870, the first year of the Standard Oil Company, he had 4% of the oil refining business, 4%. 4% of all the oil refined in the country was refined by John D. Rockefeller at Standard Oil. In 1890, 20 years later, that market share will be 90%. And that's the source of many of the monopoly charges. You have people who seem to think that that's all you need to know. 90%, that's too much. You had to run roughshod over somebody. How do you get 90% unless you have done some things that you shouldn't have done? And usually for some of these anti-market folks, that's all they need. 90%, nobody should have that much. They don't know, or at least they don't tell you, that that 90% share was fleeting. It didn't last very long for reasons I'll mention in just a moment. They don't tell you what Standard did to achieve such a high degree of customer sovereignty or customer patronage. Rockefeller steadily improved the refined product, kerosene, and steadily cut the price. This was a time, in fact, just look at these numbers. From 1863, the price of kerosene was going for 45 cents a gallon in 1863. 1873, it had fallen to 6 cents a gallon. And this is the period where he's getting into the business. And midway in that period, he starts the Standard Oil Company. Meantime, the price of kerosene plummets, and it will keep plummeting on a steadily improving quality product for the next 20 years.